Hello and welcome to all the viewers. Myself Amrita Bakshi from Ramjas College, University of Delhi, and I welcome you all to the endocrinology series of lectures. So today is the third lecture, and in the past two lectures we have discussed about the basics of endocrinology, what are hormones, what is the nature of these hormones, and how the hormones act through their receptors. So from the today's lecture you will get to know about different glands and what hormones do they secrete, what is the physiological action of those hormones, and what are the disorders related to those secretions. So to begin with the introduction, you must think about the endocrine glands, and you could take some of the examples as thyroid gland or adrenal gland, which appears to be discrete endocrine gland to you. They are a particular organ which you can imagine. But what do you think? Does these glands evolve like this only? So now let me tell you that there are certain diffused endocrine glands also, wherein you will find out some of the endocrine cells that remain scattered within the tissues of those organs which are not even endocrine in nature. Look at the example of gastrin or secretin-secreting cells in the gut. Interestingly, you would be surprised to know this thing, that in fishes, the thyroid-secreting cells are found dispersed in the ovaries. So this suggests that from these diffused endocrine glands, the discrete endocrine glands have evolved in the animal kingdom. Also, you will find some of the glands which are intermediate of diffused and discrete endocrine glands. For example, take the example of islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. So, pancreas is a gland, you are aware of that, but it is basically a heterocrine gland. So, if you look at these islets of Langerhans, they release the hormones and remain dispersed within this gland. So these endocrine cells could be neurosecretory in nature. We have discussed about this in the first and second lectures. And the other type of endocrine cell could be epithelial non-neural endocrine cell and are called as epithelial non-neural glands. And if the endocrine gland is made up of these neurosecretory cells, it is called as neurosecretory gland. Now, what is interesting is that how these two types of glands gets regulated. So, these non-neural glands are mostly stimulated by the hormones, with only a single exception of the pancreas, wherein some of the neural inputs are also there. But if we look at these neurosecretory glands, you will see that these glands get stimulated by the synaptic inputs. Thereafter, these glands are made up of, you see, the cell bodies which lie in the central nervous system, and axons of these extend out of the CNS, and these terminals of the axons lie in the neurohemal organ, for example, your pituitary gland. So after understanding this basic, we are now in a state to take up each and every gland in detail. So let us first start with the hypothalamus. So what is a hypothalamus? Hypothalamus is a neuroendocrine structure which is very small in size and sits below the hypothalamus, from where it derives its name. Hypo referring to below. Thalamus is a place in the brain. Now the boundaries of this hypothalamus is called as hypothalamic sulcus, and there is a cavity in between this hypothalamus, and this cavity is what is referred to as the third ventricle. Now it is inside this cavity which remains filled with the cerebrospinal fluid. You can see the cavity here. So this is the third ventricle. This region is the thalamus, and it is just below it lies this gland called as hypothalamus. Now this hypothalamus secretes and synthesizes some of around 9 neurohormones, and it remains connected to the pituitary gland with the help of a stalk. So now let us have a look at the zones of hypothalamus. So this space in between is what is referred to as the third ventricle. Now the region around this ventricle, which you can see with the help of a yellow color, is referred to as periventricular. So the name itself is showing that peri means in the circumference, right? Surroundings. So ventricle word refers to the space. So periventricular is the first region around the third ventricle. This is one of the zones of the hypothalamus. Now next to periventricular lies the medial region, which is shown with the help of this pinkish or orange color region. And outside to that lies the lateral hypothalamus. Now what I want to bring to your notice is that you should know that it is a very small structure within our brain. And this tiny cluster of nuclei makes up less than 1% of brain's mass. But its influence on the physiological functions of our body is enormous. It regulates sexual behavior, growth and metabolism, hunger, thirst, aggression, body weight, sleep. So n number of functions are regulated by hypothalamus. So you must be wondering that what is inside this hypothalamus which is regulating all these plethora of functions. So you must know that within these hypothalamus lies the aggregation of large neurosecretory neurons, which are referred to as hypothalamic nuclei. So there are several hypothalamic nuclei which regulates a number of functions. For example, I have kept some of the examples like suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN. It lies just above the optic chiasma and hence it is called as suprachiasmatic nucleus. And its primary function is synchronization of circadian rhythms, for example, our sleep-wake cycle or light-dark cycle. So this is one of the hypothalamic nuclei which lies in the hypothalamus. Now what are the other examples? So you can have a look at arcuate nucleus, which plays a very important role in regulating the feeding behavior. So there are several other hypothalamic nuclei for which I have brought an image from a research paper. So if you are more interested in understanding the function of each and every hypothalamic nuclei, you can refer to this recent research paper. And here you can have a look that there are nuclei like paraventricular nucleus, the arcuate nucleus which we have just mentioned, suprachiasmatic nucleus, which I have just told that plays a significant role in sleep and circadian rhythmic cyclicity. So these are several hypothalamic nuclei which contributes and controls several actions within our body. So after understanding this, now you are in a state to understand that how this hypothalamus is connected with pituitary gland. So now let us first have a look at this pituitary gland, which is also called as hypophysis. Hypo, below, and physis. So hypophysis is another name of pituitary gland. It's a small structure somewhat of 1 to 1.5 centimeters in diameter and it's a pea-shaped structure. And it lies, I will just show you within a few seconds, that it lies in a hypophyseal fossa. So fossa is a cavity wherein this pea-shaped structure sits. And this fossa or a cavity is made by what? It is made up of sella turcica of a sphenoid bone. So sphenoid bone is one of the 22 bones out of which our cranium is made up of. So here the bone is forming a fossa, a cavity wherein this pituitary gland resides. So I have just told you a few slides before that the hypothalamus is connected with the pituitary with the help of a stalk. Now what is the name of that stalk? The stalk is referred to as infundibulum. And this hypophysis or pituitary gland secretes somewhat around 7 hormones. So here you can see the structure. It is a sagittal section of pituitary gland wherein you can see the infundibulum. And now let us understand about what are these two structures. So structurally, pituitary, if you look at the pituitary gland, so structurally as well as functionally, it is divided into these two lobes, what are referred to as anterior pituitary, which is the larger one shown here in dark brown color, and the other one is the posterior pituitary, which is shown here. So these two parts are of the pituitary gland. So anterior pituitary is also referred to as adenohypophysis, and it accounts for about 75% of the total weight of the gland. So the pituitary gland is majorly made up of the anterior pituitary, and it is composed of epithelial tissue. And if you look at this anterior pituitary, it is in turn made up of two parts. The larger portion is called as pars distalis because of its location. Distal means behind. And then there is a tubular structure called as pars tuberalis, which forms the sheath around the infundibulum. You can have a look at this figure once again. So this is the anterior pituitary, and this lobe-like structure is pars distalis because of its location, its position, and this brownish color region is called as pars tuberalis. So I hope you can remember or understand these words because of their location as well. So this anterior pituitary, which is constituting the major part of the pituitary gland, is made up of different types of cells which synthesizes and secrete the specific hormones. So now let us have a look at the histological structures or histology of the anterior pituitary. So in this slide you can see there are 5 different types of cells. It includes somatotrophs, thyrotrophs, gonadotrophs, lactotrophs and corticotrophs. You must be wondering that how come these cells are appearing brownish in color. So that is simply because of the immunohistochemical localization of these hormones. So it is one of the techniques which is used to locate the specific protein within a particular cell. So because of IHC or immunohistochemistry, you can see this brownish color which is of a chemical named DAB. And the blue color is because of a hematoxylin stain which primarily stains the acidic part of the cell, and that is your DNA, that is the nucleus. So histologically you can see that there are these different types of cells, and what these cells contribute, now let us have a look at that with the help of some zooming in. So let us talk about thyrotrophs first. So these thyrotrophs produce thyrotropins, and the name of the thyrotropin is thyroid stimulating hormone, which is abbreviated here as TSH. So there are some thyrotrophs in the anterior pituitary which produces and releases TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone. So the name itself is suggesting what its function could be. So it is thyroid stimulating hormone. So it will go and act on the thyroid gland and stimulate it to produce and release its hormones, which is T3 and T4, the thyroid hormones, which will thereafter continue their or carry out their physiological function, including growth and metabolism. So this is one of the types of pituitary gland, anterior pituitary gland. Now let us have a look at this one. So there are some corticotrophs as well, if you could remember the previous slide. So these corticotrophs releases adrenocortical trophic hormone, so ACTH, which is also referred to as adrenocorticotropin or adrenocorticotropin hormone. So this will go and stimulate the adrenal cortex to produce and release glucocorticoids, including cortisol and corticosterone, which will regulate the stress response and metabolic actions. You will learn about these functions in much more detail when we will talk about the adrenal gland. But you must understand what is the function of ACTH, that it goes and acts on the adrenal cortex and stimulates its secretion. Now let us talk about another set of cells of the anterior pituitary, which were referred to as somatotrophs, which produces growth hormone. And growth hormone, as the name itself suggests, is responsible for growth of several tissues in the body, for repair of the tissues which have got harmed. So it will go and act on liver to release the insulin-like growth factors, which will stimulate the growth of several tissues, and it will also act on some other target tissues, including muscles and fat, to regulate the metabolic functions. Now let us have a look at gonadotrophs, the cells which produce gonadotropins. So in our body we have two types of gonadotropins, the luteinizing hormone LH and this FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone. So if you will understand the words, the terminology, you will get to know the functions as well. You can understand this thing that luteinizing hormone and FSH, both of them will act primarily on the gonads, that is ovaries in females, while testes in case of males. And LH is primarily involved in steroidogenesis, so it stimulates the production of sex steroid hormones and stimulate the cells of these gonads which are involved, the steroidogenic cells, to release the hormones. Whereas if you look at this FSH, it is involved in majorly gametogenesis. So it is involved in sperm production in case of males, the ovarian follicular development and secretion in case of females. So these gonadotropins are produced from the gonadotropes. Now if you look at the lactotrophs, these lactotrophs produce prolactin hormone, which acts on the mammary glands of, in case of mammals, you are aware that mammals have mammary glands only. So it acts on these mammary glands and stimulate the production of milk in the mammary glands, and also it stimulate their growth at the time of pregnancy. But if you look at other vertebrates, the non-mammalian vertebrates, so prolactin plays very important role in parental care. Then in some cases you will see that even this hormone is involved in regulating reproductive functions, in osmoregulation and water balance. Now let me talk about this hormone as well, that this is melanocyte stimulating hormone. In some of the animals, it is also produced from some of the cells of the anterior pituitary, and it stimulates and is involved in regulating the skin darkening in some of the vertebrates, including reptiles, amphibians, fishes. So here MSH is involved in skin darkening. So these are different types of cells of the anterior pituitary, and these cells of anterior pituitary produces the hormones which we have just discussed. Now let us talk about the other part of the pituitary, which is posterior pituitary, also referred to as neurohypophysis. Now neurohypophysis, why it is named so? Because you will see that it is primarily composed of neural tissue, and you will shortly understand that this receives neural supply of the hypothalamus. So just like the anterior pituitary, which is made up of two parts, the posterior pituitary is also made up of two parts. The larger bulbar portion is referred to as pars nervosa, while the stalk region is, we have already mentioned, is referred to as infundibulum. So posterior pituitary primarily releases, mark my words, releases. It is not involved in synthesis of these hormones. The synthesis will take place in hypothalamus. You will appreciate it after understanding these lectures, that posterior pituitary hormones will not be the posterior pituitary will not be synthesizing the two hormones about which we are going to discuss now. So now let us have a look at this. So this is oxytocin, which is produced in the hypothalamus but released by the posterior pituitary, and its primary target organs are uterus and mammary glands. In these two organs, if we talk at the level of cells, so basically the smooth muscle cells of uterus and mammary glands become the target of oxytocin. So oxytocin is a peptide hormone. If you could recall the first few lectures, I guess in the first lecture I have explained that oxytocin is a nonapeptide hormone. So it stimulates the contraction of these smooth muscle cells of uterus at the time of parturition, that is at the time of delivery, and at the time of ejection of milk from the nipples of the mammary glands. Again oxytocin plays a critical role. So what is regulating the secretion of oxytocin is the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus. So whenever there is response, for example uterine getting distended or nipples get stimulated, This will send a signal to the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus, which will then produce and send the oxytocin to the posterior pituitary, and then posterior pituitary will release. And now let us talk about the second hormone which is released by the posterior pituitary, and that is the vasopressin. So the target organs of vasopressin includes kidneys, sweat glands and arterioles. So principal actions of it is conservation of body water by decreasing urine volume, by decreasing water loss. That is why it is anti-diuretic. Diuresis means urine formation, urine release. So anti means against. So anti-diuretic hormone or vasopressin will conserve water by decreasing the urine volume. And it is getting again regulated by the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus. In case of elevated blood osmotic pressure, or if there is any kind of dehydration, then the signal will be sent to the hypothalamus to now produce vasopressin. Now lastly, let me tell you about the pars intermedia, which is another part, the third portion of the pituitary gland, which in most of the cases atrophies during human fetal development, and it does not exist as a separate lobe in adults, but some of the cells of it gets migrated towards the anterior part of the pituitary and it persists there. So in today's lecture, what you have understood is about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. What are their structures? What hormones are produced by the different lobes of the pituitary gland? And now in the subsequent lectures, we will see how hypothalamus and pituitary remains connected with each other. So you will appreciate the lecture by understanding different kind of diseases which occur due to the deficiency or the presence of these hormones in excess. Thank you.